On the night of June 26th, inside the Paul VI Hall, 120 cardinals sat frozen, not because of what Leo XIV had just said, but because of what he had just done. In front of every cardinal, in front of the cameras, in front of the entire Catholic world watching live, this quiet American Pope had just detonated the single most calculated move in modern Vatican history. And by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late to stop him. The extraordinary consistory had been announced weeks earlier. Most people barely paid attention. The Vatican holds these meetings. Cardinals gather, they talk, they pray, they go home. That is how it usually works. That is what everyone expected. The agenda seemed ordinary. Discussion about peace, a reflection on the Synod, a session on how the Church communicates in the modern world. Nothing that would make headlines, nothing that would shake foundations. At least that is what it looked like. But Leo had been planning something very different, and the first sign came not in Rome, but 6,000 miles away. Before we continue with the story, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are watching from. Your support means everything and keeps these stories alive. 3 weeks before the consistory, Pope Leo XIV had landed in Spain. The trip was supposed to be pastoral. Madrid, Barcelona, the Canary Islands, masses, speeches, crowds. The kind of trip a pope does. 7 days on the road, millions of people lining the streets, the largest papal visit to Spain in over a decade. But those who watched closely noticed something unusual. Leo was not just preaching, he was testing messages, planting seeds, calibrating language he would need later. In Madrid, standing before a massive crowd at the Plaza de las Ventas, he said something that most commentators glossed over. He said that Jesus walks the streets, crosses the squares, and visits our neighborhoods. That he is a God who is close, a God who walks with his people, the Lord of history. Normal papal language, right? Except Leo was not talking about theology. He was laying the groundwork. He was telling the world in plain sight what kind of church he intended to build. A church that moves, a church that walks into the mess of real life, not a church that hides behind marble walls. In Barcelona, he visited Montserrat, the ancient monastery perched on a jagged mountain. He prayed in silence for nearly 30 minutes. Cameras watched, commentators speculated. Was he reflecting? Was he struggling with some decision? Nobody knew. But later, a member of his inner circle would say that Leo already had the entire consistory mapped out in his head. Every question, every provocation, every silence. He was not praying for guidance. He was praying for courage. And then he went to the Canary Islands, Las Palmas, Tenerife, the edges of Europe, the places the Vatican usually forgets. He met with migrant families. He visited communities that had not seen a bishop in years. And he listened. He sat in small rooms with people who had nothing and listened to them describe their faith, their struggles, their feeling of abandonment by an institution that was supposed to care for them. Those conversations would show up again at the consistory word for word, and the people who needed to hear that warning were not in Spain. They were in Rome. While Leo was in Barcelona visiting Montserrat, a small group of cardinals in the Vatican were already uneasy. Word had reached them that the consistory would not follow the usual format. There would be no pre-approved talking points distributed in advance, no carefully negotiated communique drafted before anyone even sat down. Leo wanted open dialogue, real questions, real answers, and he wanted it broadcast. That last detail made several senior members of the Curia very uncomfortable. Back in Rome after Spain, Leo spent 3 days at Castel Gandolfo, his summer residence outside the city, a 17th-century palace overlooking Lake Albano. He read, he walked the gardens, he met with almost no one. His staff said he was resting after the grueling Spanish itinerary, but rest was not what was happening behind those walls. Leo was reviewing files, dossiers prepared by his closest advisors, reports from every continent about the state of the church on the ground, not the church as seen from Rome, the church as experienced by ordinary Catholics, and the picture those reports painted was devastating. Declining mass attendance across Europe, seminary closures in North America, entire regions of Latin America, where evangelical churches were growing 10 times faster than Catholic parishes, a generation of young people in Asia and Africa who respected the Pope as a figure but felt no connection to the institution. Leo absorbed all of it, and he decided that the consistory would not be another diplomatic exercise. It would be a reckoning. But on June 16th, something happened that changed the trajectory of everything. A group of journalists caught him leaving the residence. They asked him about the Society of St. Pius X, the SSPX, a breakaway traditionalist group that had been openly defying him for months. They had announced plans to consecrate 4 new bishops on July 1st without his permission, a direct challenge to his authority, a schismatic act, the kind of move that had not happened since 1988. And Leo, standing outside in the sun with no prepared statement, no press secretary beside him, looked at the cameras and spoke. He said he was considering making another appeal. He said he might ask them one more time, do not do this. Let us try to live in communion within the church. But then he added something that stunned everyone. He said, it is their choice. We need to realize what this means for them and for the church. Division is always painful. However, they refuse to accept certain fundamental elements of the church. And while I regret that choice, we must move forward. We must move forward. 4 words. And in those 4 words, every assumption about Leo XIV shattered because the world had been told a story about this pope. The media had built a narrative. Leo was the peacemaker, the bridge builder, the quiet Augustinian friar from Chicago who would heal divisions and calm the storms that Pope Francis had stirred up. He was supposed to be the pope who would bring the traditionalists back into the fold, who would soften the edges, who would compromise. That was the story. And Leo had let that story circulate for over a year. He never corrected it. He never pushed back. He let people believe what they wanted to believe. But that was the strategy. What no one understood, what almost nobody in the media grasped, was that Leo had never intended to bring the traditionalists back by giving them what they wanted. He intended to bring them back by making the church so clearly, so undeniably committed to its own path, that the only choice left would be to walk with it or walk away. He was not closing doors. He was defining the building. And if some people did not want to live in that building, that was, as he said, their choice. The consistory was where all of this came together. June 26th, Friday morning. Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, 120 cardinals from every continent. Leo presided. The homily was short. He spoke about the vine, about how Christ said, I am the true vine. He talked about unity, but not the kind of unity that comes from ignoring problems. The kind that comes from obedience, from listening, from accepting that the Holy Spirit might be leading the church somewhere uncomfortable. After Mass, they moved to the Paul VI Hall. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, the Dean of the College of Cardinals, gave the opening address. Then Leo stood, and this is where the world's assumptions began to fall apart. Leo did not give a speech. He asked a question. He looked at the assembled cardinals and said, in what kind of world are we called to proclaim the gospel? And then he sat down. He did not elaborate. He did not offer his own answer. He just asked the question and waited. The silence lasted 11 seconds. It felt like 11 minutes. Cardinal Rice of Krakow was the first to speak. He offered a biblical meditation, but within minutes the conversation shifted. Cardinals began talking not in the usual polished Vatican style, with carefully worded interventions read from prepared texts. They were actually talking, sharing, describing what they saw in their own countries, their own dioceses, the wars, the poverty, the young people leaving the faith, the rise of artificial intelligence, replacing jobs and reshaping how people think, the polarization tearing societies apart. And Leo sat there listening, taking notes, saying almost nothing. But what happened next changed everything. The afternoon session was supposed to focus on the culture of power and the civilization of love. Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, the prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, was scheduled to introduce the theme. He did. He drew from Leo's own encyclical Magnifica Humanitas. He talked about how technology is never neutral, how it takes on the characteristics of those who create it and use it, how the church must engage with artificial intelligence, not as a crisis to manage, but as a challenge that demands a rethinking of its entire social doctrine. But then Fernandez did something unexpected. He pivoted. He brought up the SSPX situation directly in front of all the cardinals, and he laid out the timeline, the failed negotiations, the SSPX's refusal to suspend their plans, the open letter they had sent just 2 days earlier, on June 24th to Leo, and every cardinal in the room, a 28-page profession of faith that denounced liberalism, modernism, and ecumenism that called the post-Vatican II Church a ship lost at sea. The room tensed. Several conservative cardinals shifted in their seats. This was not on the agenda. This was not how the Vatican does things. You do not air internal conflicts in front of the full college. You handle these things quietly through back channels, through diplomatic language and careful maneuvering. But Leo had told Fernandez to do it. That was the point. Because Leo wanted every single cardinal to see the situation clearly, not filtered through rumors, not softened by diplomatic ambiguity. He wanted them to see what the SSPX was actually saying, that Vatican II was an error, that the reforms of the last 60 years were a betrayal, that the only true church was the one frozen in 1962. And then Leo wanted them to see something else, something that most of the media had completely missed. He wanted them to see that the same logic, the same impulse to reject, to resist, to freeze the church in a moment that felt safe was not limited to the SSPX. It existed inside the room. It existed among cardinals who would never associate themselves with a breakaway group, but who in practice operated from the same fear. The fear that moving forward meant losing something essential. The fear that change meant compromise. The fear that the world was too dangerous to engage with. Honestly, Leo was not attacking anyone. He was holding up a mirror. And then he spoke. He stood slowly, adjusted his glasses, and he said something that would be quoted in every newspaper, every broadcast, every Catholic blog on the planet within hours. He said, "We cannot build the civilization of love if we are afraid of the world God created. Fear does not protect the faith. Fear buries it." The room went completely still, he continued. He talked about his trip to Spain, how he had visited neighborhoods where the church had no presence, how he had met families who had never seen a priest, how he had sat with young people who told him they believed in God but could not recognize him in the institution that claimed to represent him. And he said, "That is our failure, not theirs, ours. We made the church a fortress when it was meant to be a field hospital." That phrase, a field hospital, it was not new. Pope Francis had used it years ago. But Leo was not recycling language. He was reclaiming it. He was saying this idea was right, and we have not done enough with it. And the reason we have not done enough is because too many of us in this room were more comfortable with the fortress. Several cardinals looked down. Others nodded. A few looked visibly angry. But Leo was not finished. He brought up Magnificat Humanitas, his own encyclical, released just 1 month earlier, the first encyclical of his pontificate, a document that most secular commentators had dismissed as a routine Vatican statement about technology. They were wrong. Leo had personally presented the encyclical at the Vatican, breaking with tradition. Most popes delegate that task to cardinals. Leo wanted to stand at the podium himself. He wanted his voice attached to every word. And now, at the consistory, he connected it to everything happening in the room. He said that the encyclical was not really about technology. It was about a choice. The same choice humanity faces in every era. The same choice the church faces right now in this room on this day. Whether to build a Tower of Babel or to build a city where God and humanity dwell together. Whether to use power to climb higher or to reach wider. He said the SSPX had made their choice. They wanted the tower. They wanted to reach heaven by going backward, by climbing on the rubble of everything the church had learned in 60 years. And he said, "I will not join them on that climb. But I will pray for them because the fall from a tower built on pride is always devastating." That was the moment. That was the moment the world realized it had been wrong about Leo XIV. He was not the quiet compromiser. He was not the soft-spoken bridge builder waiting to make everyone happy. He was a strategist who had spent 14 months letting people underestimate him, letting the narrative form around him like fog, and then at the exact moment of maximum impact, he burned the fog away. But what happened on the second day of the consistory was even more shocking. Saturday, June 27th, the cardinals returned to the Paul VI Hall. They expected the discussion to continue in the same format. Open dialogue, reflections, maybe some kind of closing statement. Instead, Leo changed the entire structure of the session. He told the cardinals they would not be discussing themes. They would be discussing people, real people, specific situations. He had prepared case studies, not from academic sources, from parish priests, from missionaries, from chaplains in war zones and refugee camps, stories of real Catholics facing impossible situations. A woman in Congo who had been excommunicated for remarrying after her husband was killed by militia. A family in the Philippines whose parish had been closed because there were no priests. A teenager in Germany who had left the church after being told that asking questions about faith meant he lacked faith. A grandmother in Colombia who walked 4 hours every Sunday to attend Mass because her village had not had a resident priest in 11 years. A young father in South Korea who wanted to baptize his child, but was told his interfaith marriage made it complicated. Leo read each case aloud, slowly with detail. He described the woman in Congo by name. He described her village. He described the day she was told she could no longer receive communion. Some cardinals looked visibly shaken. Others tried to maintain composure. But the room was different now. The air felt different because these were not statistics. These were human beings. And after each one he asked the same question. What does the church owe this person? Not what does doctrine say, not what is the canonical position. What does the church owe this person? It was a masterful move because it forced the cardinals to stop talking about the church as an institution and start talking about it as a community of human beings. It forced them out of abstraction and into reality. And it exposed something that Leo had clearly identified months ago: the gap, the enormous growing gap between the Church's official positions and the lived experience of its members. A gap that was not caused by the world changing too fast, a gap caused by the Church changing too slow. Several cardinals pushed back. A cardinal from Africa argued that the Church could not abandon its teachings to accommodate every individual situation. A cardinal from Eastern Europe warned that this approach risked turning the Church into a social services agency rather than a guardian of eternal truth. Leo listened to all of it, and then he responded with 5 words that cut through every argument. He said, "Mercy is not a compromise. Mercy is not a compromise." He let that settle. And then he added, "We have been acting as though compassion weakens doctrine. It does not. Compassion is doctrine. If our theology cannot hold a suffering person, then our theology is incomplete." The conservative cardinals did not applaud. But they did not object either, because the argument was not progressive or conservative. It was not political. It was pastoral. And Leo had framed it in a way that made opposition look like indifference to suffering. Not wrong, not heretical, just cold. And that was deliberate, because Leo understood something that most popes before him had struggled with. The battle inside the Church was never really about theology. It was about temperature, warm versus cold, engaged versus detached, present versus absent, and he had just moved the thermostat. By the time the consistory closed on Saturday evening, the mood in the Vatican had fundamentally shifted. Not because Leo had imposed new rules, not because he had issued decrees or threatened consequences, but because he had done something far more powerful. He had changed the conversation. For months, the conversation inside the Vatican had been about resistance, about the SSPX, about traditionalists versus reformers, about who was right and who was wrong. Leo erased that conversation. He replaced it with a different question: not who is right, but who are we serving? Not what are we preserving, but who are we reaching? And in doing so, he neutralized his opposition without ever confronting them directly, because you cannot argue against serving people. You cannot stand up in a room full of cardinals and say, "No, we should not care about that woman in Congo. No, we should not worry about that teenager in Germany." The moment you try, you have already lost. That was the trap, and they walked right into it. On Sunday, June 28th, Leo gave the Angelus address in St. Peter's Square. The crowd was larger than usual. Word had spread. People wanted to hear from the Pope, who had just shaken the College of Cardinals. Leo stood at the window. He spoke about the Gospel reading about detachment, loss, and hospitality, and he said something that many interpreted as a direct message to the SSPX, though he never mentioned them by name. He said, "Love requires at least 3 things: detachment from what we cling to, acceptance of what we lose, and hospitality toward what is new. If we refuse any of these, we refuse love itself." Detachment from what we cling to. The traditionalists heard that and understood. The reformers heard it and celebrated. The rest of the world heard it and began to realize that this Pope was playing a game that no one had anticipated. Because here is what most people still did not understand. Leo had not just made a theological point at the consistory. He had made a political one. By forcing the cardinals to engage with real human suffering, by asking, "What do we owe this person?" he had created a new standard, a new test. Every policy, every doctrine, every decision the Church made going forward would now be measured against that question, not by Leo, by the cardinals themselves, because they had been in the room. They had heard the stories. They had been forced to respond, and their responses were on record. Leo had made accountability unavoidable without ever using the word. And there was one more thing, one detail that almost nobody caught at the time. During the first session of the consistory, when Leo asked his opening question about the kind of world they were called to serve, he had referenced his own visit to Sapienza University in Rome from May. He had quoted himself. He had said that those who seek truth are ultimately seeking God whether they realize it or not. It seemed like a throwaway line, a papal platitude, but it was not. It was aimed at a very specific audience: the technology sector, the artificial intelligence industry, the same people his encyclical had addressed. Because Leo was not just reforming the Church, he was positioning it. He was saying the Church has something to say about the future, about technology, about what it means to be human in an age of machines. And if you think the Vatican is irrelevant, you have not been paying attention. In the days after the consistory, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Catholic media went into overdrive. Progressive voices praised Leo for his courage. Conservative voices accused him of ambushing the cardinals. Some called it a setup, others called it a masterclass. One Italian columnist wrote that Leo had turned the consistory into a courtroom where the Church itself was on trial. An American commentator said it was the most significant gathering of cardinals since Vatican II. A Spanish newspaper ran the headline, "The Pope Who Stopped Asking Permission." Secular media, which usually ignores Vatican politics, ran the story on front pages. The New York Times, Le Monde, The Guardian, Der Spiegel. Because the narrative was irresistible. The quiet Pope who turned out to be the most strategic leader the Vatican had seen in decades. The man everyone underestimated. The man who waited 14 months and then moved with a precision that left his opponents standing in place wondering what had just happened. But the most significant reaction came from within the Vatican itself. On the evening of June 28th, after the Angelus, a group of senior cardinals requested a private meeting with Leo. They wanted to discuss what had happened. They wanted to understand his intentions. They wanted to know if the consistory was a one-time event or the beginning of something larger. Leo received them in the Apostolic Palace. It was late. The lights of St. Peter's Square glowed through the windows. He was calm. He offered them coffee. He asked about their health. He made small talk about the weather in Rome. Classic Leo, disarming, warm, making people feel comfortable right before he says something they will never forget. And when they asked him what his plan was, he gave them the answer that would define the rest of his pontificate. He said, Plans are rigid, directions are alive, and the direction is simple. We go where the people are, we listen to what they need, and we respond with everything we have. If that scares you, ask yourself why. If that scares you, ask yourself why." The room went quiet. One of the cardinals looked at the floor. Another cleared his throat. One of the cardinals reportedly said, "Holy Father, some will say you are dismantling tradition." Leo looked at him. He did not blink. He did not pause to think. He replied, "I am not dismantling tradition. I am dismantling the excuse that tradition gives us to do nothing." Another cardinal tried a different approach. He said, "But Holy Father, the faithful in my country want stability. They want to know that the Church will not change its core teachings." Leo nodded. He said, "I agree, and the core teaching is love. If love is not at the center of every policy, every ruling, every decision we make, then we have already changed the core teaching. We changed it the moment we put something else first." That exchange never made it to the press, but it circulated through Vatican corridors within hours. By Monday morning, every curial official in Rome had heard it, and everyone knew that something fundamental had shifted. And then on June 29th, the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, Leo presided at Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, the feast day that celebrates the two foundational pillars of the Church, Peter the Rock, Paul the Missionary, stability and movement, tradition and transformation. Leo used the homily to bring both together. He spoke about how Peter and Paul disagreed, how they argued, how Paul confronted Peter to his face when Peter wavered on including Gentiles in the early church, and he said the church was born in disagreement. It was born in the tension between staying and going, between holding firm and reaching out. That tension is not a problem. It is our DNA. The moment we resolve it, the moment we choose one over the other, we stop being the church. It was a statement aimed at everyone, at the SSPX who wanted to stay frozen, at the progressives who wanted to move without looking back, at the conservatives in the Curia who wanted stability above all else. Leo was telling all of them, "You are wrong if you think this is a zero-sum game. The church needs both, and I will hold both, even when it hurts." That evening, Leo returned to Castel Gandolfo. He would spend the next day drafting his final appeal to the SSPX before their planned consecrations on July 1st, an appeal that would be released on June 30th, an appeal that would ask them one last time to turn back. But everyone who had been in the consistory knew the truth. Leo was not expecting them to turn back. He had already moved forward. He had already defined the church he was building. And if the SSPX walked away, the loss would be theirs, not his. Because Leo had done something no one thought possible. He had made the future more compelling than the past, and he had done it on purpose. Every single move, the trip to Spain, the silence at Castel Gandolfo, the open question at the consistory, the case studies, the mirror he held up to the cardinals, the encyclical about technology and human dignity, the way he handled the press, the way he let the world build its assumptions and then shattered them at the perfect moment. All of it was deliberate, all of it was connected, and all of it pointed to a single, undeniable conclusion. The world had believed Leo XIV was a placeholder pope, a transitional figure, a man who would keep the seat warm and avoid controversy. The world believed he was cautious, moderate, safe. The world was wrong. Leo was never safe. He was patient. And patience, when combined with clarity and courage, is the most dangerous force in any institution because it does not announce itself. It does not warn. It simply waits until the moment is right, and then it acts decisively, irreversibly, without apology. The cardinals who left Rome after the consistory understood this, many of them for the first time. They had arrived in Rome thinking they were attending a routine meeting. They left knowing they had witnessed the beginning of a transformation, not in doctrine, not in theology, but in posture, in the way the church holds itself, in the way it faces the world. Leo had shifted the center of gravity, and gravity once shifted does not go back. In the weeks and months ahead, the implications of what happened in late June would ripple outward into dioceses, into parishes, into the daily lives of over 1 billion Catholics. The question Leo asked, "What does the Church owe this person?" would become the defining question of his pontificate, not because he made it official, but because he made it unavoidable. And that is the real story. Not that Leo surprised the world, but that the world was so busy looking at the Pope it expected to see that it missed the Pope who was actually there. Robert Francis Prevost, born in Chicago, the son of a working-class family, an Augustinian friar who joined the order at a young age and then did something unusual. He left the United States. He went to Peru not for a few months, for decades. He lived in small towns. He built parishes from nothing. He learned to speak Spanish like a native. He ate with farmers. He buried children who died from diseases that should have been curable. He saw what poverty does to faith, and he saw what the absence of the church does to communities that need it most. That experience shaped everything. It shaped how he leads, how he listens, how he fights. Because Leo does not fight like a politician. He fights like a pastor who has seen too much suffering to tolerate institutional cowardice. He fights with questions, with silence, with patience that looks like passivity until the moment it becomes a wall that nothing can move. A man who learned to lead by listening, who learned to fight by staying calm, who learned that the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of powerful people is ask a simple question and wait. The church has not seen a pope like this in a very long time, maybe ever. And now, for the first time, the world is starting to realize it. Everything they believed about him just fell apart, and he would not have it any other way. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it changed the way you see what is happening inside the Vatican right now, then do something simple. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment telling me what you think Leo's next move will be, because this story is far from over.